For most people, and I mean 99.9% of the global population, consciousness is not a problem. They just take it for granted. And guess what? They're right. Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
All right. To scare you away at first, we're going to talk about the mystery of consciousness.
Oh, boy.
But actually, to make it practical, I think that this is at the center of many of our misunderstandings about artificial intelligence. I think it has a lot to do, I think it's actually at the center of the major question of our age: what does it mean to be human as well? And so lots of really practical outworkings here. But let me just start by saying something that I said to you earlier, Nathan. And Nathan really liked this a lot, so I'll say it here. For most people, and I mean 99.9% of the global population, consciousness is not a problem. They just take it for granted. And guess what? They're right. The good news is here, this is only a major philosophical problem if you've bought into a certain vision of reality. The problem is, though, and here's what I think we'll talk about this quite a bit on this episode, the problem is that a lot of us buy into it without realizing that that is what we're doing.
Wait
this
a
is
second.
Part of what happens when you're formed by your culture.
Are you saying that we're subconsciously formed into thinking about consciousness? Because that's a little rich.
Yeah, it's a little on the nose.
Ironic, yeah.
Yeah, it's a little rich. Yeah, but I suppose so. Yeah.
All right, well, spell it out. Convince me.
Well, if you think of the universe in mechanistic terms, basically, consciousness, and I'll talk about, let's define consciousness, I guess, a little bit. I think it's relatively self-explanatory. By consciousness, I don't mean anything special. I just mean, among other things, your subjective experience of the world. I mean also that your subjective experience of the world is a unified experience. That is, it's not strictly divisible. You can't cut it into little segments. This is a unified vision of reality that you have. I'm talking also about your self-awareness. I'm talking about intentionality. That's a really big one, that you, when you're doing things, you're doing them, you're directing your actions toward a specific end. And there's a purpose in your actions. And as a side note, as a Christian, I'm also going to say that I think you're always seeking the good.
Okay.
Even if you're doing so in a way that's misguided.
Let me throw a flag on the play here.
Yeah, do it.
No, that's a good introduction. So here's the question I have, though, is do you see a uniqueness to human consciousness as in degree or kind? And to ask that more specifically, because there would be other animals that notably would have a sense of themselves, which is often used, particularly in animal rights, as kind of a litmus test for consciousness of, is this a creature that understands, that would recognize themselves in the mirror, for example, so has kind of some sort of an external awareness of who they are, and to some extent does have will and desire, and has strategies and plans and enacts them. Now, I think it's overblown when we're talking about that most of the time in the animal world, but there is some degree of that. I mean, even in something as simple as your dog, you would see some of those features. So is that consciousness? And then B, is that consciousness different in degree or in kind from that of a human?
All right, I'm going to this is a total jerk maneuver. Let me turn it on you for a second, because you actually have done quite a bit of study in the realm of these, especially in the area of animal rights. So I'm curious about, I will absolutely give you my answer. I'm curious about how you answer that one, Nathan, because I know that question has been posed directly to you before.
So I think on the first one, you would say, okay, there's certainly mental activity that's happening. If human, I'm very, very tempted to say that human consciousness is a different kind of consciousness. If it's a different degree of consciousness, then it's an orders of magnitude different. So a couple reasons for that. One is we don't have just an awareness of ourselves, we have an awareness of other selves, awareness of ourselves, and we also can form that in complex language in relation to a complex system. I would say, I would say humans are unique in that our conscientiousness allows worship. So there's an extra spiritual component to our consciousness that makes it categorically different from that of an animal. So I don't want to demean the creativity of the created world as far as the animal world goes. And we would overlap certainly on our subconscious processes,
Sure.
our desire for food, reproduction, shelter, whatever. But I do think that humans have a whole nother category. And this is what I think actually makes this question challenging is on some hand, on the common sense part, this is where it gets kicked up to the next level to say, yeah, but what is it about human conscientiousness that's different from because if it's chemical and we reduce it just to the chemistry of our brain, then our brain structures and the amounts of chemicals in the neural networks and pathways and the ways things are work together there aren't that different. So give me ambiguity or give me something else. I'm going to go with human consciousness shares some things in degree with the animal world, but is also categorically different.
Yeah, and I appreciate your hesitancy there because we're learning more and more about animal communication, but I think I'm also tempted. So I want to respect that this is a growing field of research, particularly, correct me if I'm wrong, Nathan, the studies of chimps, for instance, have yielded some similarities. There are some parallels there. But I agree with you. I actually like your turn of phrase there. Orders of magnitude different. My strong hunch, and it's more than just a gut feeling. It's based on my own, my experience of human life, the astounding intricacy and phenomenon of language, all of that. My hunch is that we're talking about a difference, not just in degree, but in kind.
Well, hang on a second.
But certainly
so is that
will come up. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's push into this for a second because I think you're about to take us in the direction of saying that a reductionistic view of consciousness is part of this assumed idea that gives us more of a mechanistic look at. So maybe I'm backtracking here. Is conscientiousness distinguishable from instinct in the sense that do you think there's a non-reductionistic component to a squirrel's brain in the same way that you do to a human brain? Or can we take the physical animal world and say,
Sure,
hey, we can explain their behavior by looking at their brain chemistry and brain patterns. That's not the same as what we can do with the human. I haven't thought of it in these terms before.
there's a stronger correlation. No, but it's a helpful question. I would say, on the face of it, there certainly seems to be a much stronger correlation between instinctive impulses, survival instincts, and animal behavior. That is absolutely not the case with human beings. That's where we do fall into, based on our behavior, we fall into an entirely different category. You can use some of the trivial sort of joking examples, but there are no tigers gathered together at conferences pondering what it means to be a tiger. On the other hand, we write books about what it means to be a person and how to find your inner child and unleash your creative capacities and be who you really are and discover who you are, discover your true identity. Our culture is tying itself in knots over the question of identity. Those are very unusual modes of behavior that you don't find anywhere else in the animal kingdom. But to backtrack just a little bit here, so a reductive view of consciousness is a concomitant or it comes along. It's a package deal with a mechanistic view of the universe or reality. So the leading intellectual luminaries, people like David Chalmers or Daniel Dennett, who are writing about consciousness and who are somewhat household names, which is unusual in a field like philosophy of mind. But they are naturalists. They're thoroughgoing naturalists. So they have an ideological commitment to the notion that we can offer, there needs to be a physicalist account of all human behavior. And so for somebody like Daniel Dennett, for instance, consciousness as we experience it is really more of an illusion. It's something that he will handily work to explain away.
Sam Harris also.
But my point here, Sam Harris also, yes. So my point here is you have a dilemma that's completely unnecessary. If you look at the universe in mechanistic terms, then consciousness becomes a huge problem for you. But if you don't, then, consciousness remains absolutely amazing, and its richness is just incredible, and it's mysterious, but it's not a huge problem for you. And you're perfectly fine in taking for granted the fact that you have a unique subjective experience of the world, and that it is a unified experience, that you're capable of rational thought, and that you're capable of intentionality, and that, yeah, there's some kind of link between your brain and your mind, but you also just, the common sense notion that you're never going to, get intention out of physical processes is just, you can take that for granted. Firing of synapses in your brain is not going to yield some sort of an intention. And if somebody asks you a question or something and a certain region of your brain lights up, if they're testing you, sure, that's really interesting. Sure, yeah, there's some physical, there's some activity, there's some physical event going on, but in no way does that give you access to the content of the thoughts in a person's head, or much less explain them away.
Let me just follow up on what you're saying there, because and herein lies one of the key distinctions where the phrase artificial intelligence is nowhere near to artificial consciousness, is that contrary to what you may have heard, you can't scientifically read somebody's mind or brain. So you can track the electrical flow and look at the excitement levels, or basically the blood flow changes in certain parts of people's brains, and you can say, oh, this person's depressed, or this person's excited, or this person's afraid. You can kind of get those general categories, but it's not like you can capture the electrical signals, pulses in the brain, extrapolate those out on the computer screen, and then be able to read and say, here's what this person's thought is. However, if you were to capture a segment of data in the process of an artificial intelligence system, you could extrapolate that exactly out word for word onto a screen. So we can take the bits of the electrical data within an artificial intelligence algorithm and know exactly what it's doing. We're nowhere close to being able to do that with a human. So the way the packaging of the information as it travels through your mind on the conversation of consciousness is fundamentally not, there's not a computer analogy or a mechanistic analogy that we've discovered yet that we could say it's like this, because it's not like anything else that we know about yet.
Well, and speaking of analogy, I want to bring in metaphor now, because our metaphors tend to take us for rides. And we have been in the habit for several years now of thinking about our minds, or thinking about our brains, and then by extension, our minds as computers. And we also are in the habit, so there's a twofold thing going on. We tend to think about our brain as a computer. I think Daniel Dennett is the one who gives us the phrase syntactical engine. That's his word for it.
Romantic.
But we also, very romantic. We also have a tendency to talk about technology in anthropomorphic terms. And this is, I think I've told you this, Nathan, I am a real stickler about this with my children. So if somebody brings up Alexa and happens to say she, I try always, no, this is not a she. This is a program. It's an it. And then, so now they're even at the point where they'll look at me, I know, Dad, it's an it, and they'll roll their eyes. But these conversations are having to happen more and more because we use human language to describe our machines. We talk about our computers having memory. We talk about our computers thinking. And these are not insignificant phrases. They're not innocuous. They're not harmless. To a certain extent, we've got to use analogies. We've got to use metaphors to communicate and to talk, especially if we're talking about some sort of abstract processes and things like that. But they do have a pronounced tendency to mislead us. And we see that over and over again. And another way you can look at this, Nathan, is if you look at some of our, particularly a lot of our movies, which sort of further blur the lines for the sake of stories where, you have fully conscious machines that are taking over. But all of that is basically resting on a very emaciated vision of what consciousness actually is. And it does tend to affect us. And again, I said this earlier, we Christians, just like everybody else, tend to imbibe the assumptions of our culture because they're drilled into us relentlessly. It's not like you sit down one day and you make a conscientious decision. I shall now look at myself in reductive terms. I'm going to have a reductive view of consciousness, and this is going to color my perception of human interaction. No, of course not. No, these are tacit assumptions that are just hammered in, and it's kind of death by a thousand cuts. So I like Susanna Black Roberts, who she's one of the editors at Plow Magazine. She tweeted this a while ago, back on the artist formerly known as Twitter. But she said that the key challenge of our age will be to be human, to be fully human. And obviously we're all, we can't not be human, but, not acting as though we're machines, not treating other people like machines, not treating people in mechanistic terms, not treating people like kind of glorified computers. I think that's right. And so I think consciousness is also it's at the forefront of a lot of our debates about what it means to be human as well. We tend to go immediately in the direction of identity and sexuality, and those are massively important. But consciousness is here too as a very important topic, which is so this could be more practical.
And you know why, right?
Why I'm bringing it up.
Because when you look at the animal world, let's talk about running, jumping, swimming, staying warm in cold conditions, certainly flight. I mean, you can find an animal that is better than you at almost any physical category you can conceive of. Height, weight, speed, strength, navigation, whatever. I mean, the animal world is phenomenal, but so why we immediately tend toward consciousness is because it seems to be the one where humans or just excel in an entirely different category. So I think it's right that our conversation is there. It's also a little weird. It's kind of like this idea of time. Everybody knows what it is until you start thinking about it. That this has tied philosophers in knots for millennia. So we're probably not going to get it sorted out here, other than to say your thesis, Cameron, is interesting in the sense that you're saying it's not really a necessary question unless you accept a certain restrictive set of conditions. I'm still trying to think through that. I think you might be right.
Well, what that is, I'm going to give you the history of that real quickly to try to give you a little bit more justification for that claim. Essentially, I'm going to make another really big claim here, but I've got some historic evidence for all of these. From time immemorial, human beings have taken it for granted that there's a spiritual dimension to humanity, and that there is such a thing as a soul, that consciousness is a vital part of who we are. I mean, you can look to ancient Greece for very sophisticated thought on the matter. You can look to the East, Indian philosophy, especially the Upanishads, for instance. There are some amazing distillations and explorations of the mystery of consciousness. And lest you think that I'm some great scholar of Indian philosophy or anything like that, I am not. David Bentley Hart has been a very helpful guide in this process, and he's working on a book on this right now, by the way. And one of Hart's areas of expertise is actually Eastern religions, because David Bentley Hart is ridiculous. He is very versatile as a thinker, and he's immensely gifted as an intellectual. But his book, The Experience of God, has a really excellent section on consciousness in it. And this is where I drew a lot of my insights. He's also at work on a new book for Yale University Press on consciousness, which he's structured as a dialogue, which should be really fun. But anyway, all that to say is you have a wonderful ancient pedigree for great thinking on consciousness where it was taken for granted. You have beautiful systems of thought around it. It's really the scientific, it's the latter part of the sort of the repercussions of the scientific revolution that where a mechanistic view of the universe was. So I want to be careful with this because there's a usefulness to this. So to a certain extent, some of the hard sciences work really well, and Nathan, you can say a lot about this. You know more about this than I do. They work really well when you narrow the lens a little bit and you subtract mind or consciousness from whatever it is you're studying, and you look at it in terms of, sort of a causal change, cause and effect, and you look at it in mechanistic terms. So that was understood to be a scientific tool for a while. And it was deployed in very specific contexts. It wasn't seen as a worldview. But what, of course, happens, and this happens slowly over the years, is people begin seeking some sort of unified theory of all being. And then eventually you come to a place, once upon a time but you come to a place where people believe that, say, the study of physics will yield a full transcript of reality. But you and I would stand back there and just say, well, that's really just based on a category mistake, because physics can't possibly, it's not even meant to explain all of reality. But so when you do that and you blow this mechanistic view, which is a scientific tool for investigating certain phenomena, when you turn it into a full worldview and everything comes under that umbrella and everything has to be seen in those terms, then you have created for yourself all sorts of problems because there's so much you have to explain away. And consciousness is one of those things.
I'll give you some examples here.
Does that make... Yeah.
Yeah, so on one hand, though, I mean, you go back even Plato, there's been some pretty deep wrestlings about what is the most real, what's true, what's the fundamental, back even in Aristotle, first principles, prime mover,
sure.
What's behind all of this.
I mean, Plato is the great he's the great dualist. Yeah. So
you read Psyche in your sophomore philosophy classes and all that. But and there were people during that time who thought in reductionistic terms that it's all just down to atoms and there would be these little pieces that congeal together and that explains all of reality. Yeah, Democritus was. So, I mean, that was a pretty long time ago, and he was close to where we are in our modern thinking. So there's a bit of that going on. To put some practical legs under some of the ideas you were saying there, and you're talking about the reductionism that's necessary for some of our forms of study. And I think there have been physicists that have pursued that, string theory and other ways of looking at reality. But I remember one time I was having lunch with some guys. Some were theologians, and this was my college. Some were theologians and philosophers, and some were physicists. And that's always a good lunchtime. And what was interesting is the physics professors were Christians, and the philosophy and religions, it's a little murky there. And one of the physics professors said to one of the theology professors, in response, I can't remember what the question was, but the physics professor said, well, what do you know about grace? Or what can you say about grace? And the theology professor says, oh, I don't know anything about grace. That's outside of my field of expertise. And I was just dying laughing listening to that, where you have like somebody who had a PhD in theology, but had narrowed the scope of their focus so far down into the minutia that they couldn't give a comment on, oh, I don't know anything about grace. That's outside my field of, And so the problem with a reductionistic worldview is that it narrows the size of your world down to something smaller than what you can actually live in. And that's why the common sense model has proliferated, because I don't want to say just the sheer pragmatism of it, but the functionality of being able to have an integrated and expansive view, the livability of it is extremely low in a reductionistic. Hey, here's another example. I was listening to, and I may have mentioned this before, a guy, I think this was an NPR radio thing. I was driving somewhere, and there was a neuroscientist who was talking about how freedom is an illusion. and that it can, our choices can come down to chemical, very reductionistic. And the interviewer was shrewd. And he said to the guy, he said, so does that mean that your grandfather shouldn't have gotten a Purple Heart for courage in the war? And you could hear the scientist stuttering here, because everything that he was pontificating is that his grandfather wasn't courageous. He was just dancing to the chemicals in his mind. And it's right. Like, do you give a Purple Heart to someone for courage? Or, a Medal of Honor for courage and Purple Heart for being wounded in that. So, to me, that's a good example of this, like, oh, yeah, here's where we're just talking out of our mouths. But then when we actually try to live it out.
Well, nobody actually thinks that. You can't. I mean, just like a while ago, this was a fairly recent interview. I suppose he was in his 70s. He's in his 90s now. Noam Chomsky, the famous linguistic scholar. When somebody asked him about a debate he had with Michel Foucault about moral relativism, and he just said, nobody's a moral relativist. And remember, Noam Chomsky's not a Christian. And then the interview was a little taken aback. He goes, oh, no, on a practical level, how would anybody be a moral relativist? You can't live and be a moral relativist just to get around in this world. Nobody is a moral relativist. There's nobody who believes in pure determinism on a practical level. You can't.
You can get a research grant for it, though.
You absolutely get a research grant for it, and you can write. See, here's the other thing. You can write a monograph that is very internally consistent, but internal consistency is not necessarily a good and noble thing. Peter Kraft once pointed out, I love this. Somebody said, and this was about Peter Singer, well, he's remarkably consistent, and that's really admirable. And Peter Kraft, well, what's so great about consistency? There might be somebody out there who says, I'm Jesus Christ, who's locked up in an asylum, and he's very internally consistent with his story. Nevertheless, it's not a very particularly noble story, and he's completely deluded. In fact, he's a lunatic. So I think, internal consistency only takes you so far. You have to take it with a grain of salt. And some of these stories are so inherently, they take you in such silly directions. And so if that sounds disrespectful, I do happen to believe that scientific naturalism takes you into some very incoherent territory, because you are forced. I don't think we can overstate, Nathan, how hard it actually is to be a consistent atheist. How much of human experience you have to explain away. You've got to find ways to say, oh yeah, your perception of the redness of a rose, yeah, that's an illusion. Oh, your feelings of love toward another person, yeah, that's also an illusion. The sense of moral agency and freedom that you have in your everyday interactions, yeah, also all illusions, not real.
Well, yeah, well, so even,
but there's probably no God, so you should lighten up.
Yeah, but the thing is, like, there are some who live on the border of despair of trying to be consistent. So somebody, distant relative who's attempts to live very consistently as an atheist, would say, look, my child is sick and is dying. They're not one of the fittest ones. They shouldn't survive, according to the way I look at the world. But my mother's heart breaks down and I take him to the doctor. And wrestling with the struggle of, like, what she thinks is actually best for the species and what she thinks is a mother, and feeling like those things are in tension, that would be a hard thing to live with. So to loop this back around, then,
I mean, yeah, I need to be careful here too.
Well, no,
Peter Kraft kept his mother on life support.
Yeah,
and reporters asked him about that numerous times, and he said, "I'm just being inconsistent."
The thing here is, though, that all fantasy is internally consistent. Good fantasy is, but we call it fantasy because it doesn't correspond to reality.
Peter Singer, sorry, not Kraft.
Right? Yeah, I was thinking, why is Peter Kraft not being consistent?
Yeah,
but
no, not Peter Kraft.
You know what I'm saying? So fantasy is internally consistent, but it doesn't correspond to reality, and we call it fantasy. And then there are things that we think correspond to reality but are inconsistent, and those are just individual experiences that don't fit into. That's when you know you're going crazy, when you're the only one who has a certain experience.
Sure.
So the livability of it is important. But let me throw in some ideas here that I think, if you look biblically speaking at what a human is, let's try to, since we're not going to answer this scientifically anytime in the near future. I think when I was a little kid, my grandpa once said to me, if you can't look through a microscope and see your mind, you won't be able to look through a telescope and see God. Which is an interesting inverse So if you want to know what's wrong with me, it's having a grandfather who said things like that to me when I was a little kid. But it points against the reductionism, right? Of saying there are physical things you can see through a telescope, but that you're not going to find God there. And there are chemical and physiological things you can see in your mind, but in your brain, but you're not going to find your mind there. Is to say you have these ideas in Scripture where, let's go with Psalm 1, and on his law he meditates day and night. So you have a phrase, I think it's called a merism, actually. When you look at opposites, so day and night, the intent there is to say that here's somebody who thinks about the laws of God all the time. And so the way that you say all the time is you put the opposites in there. So day and night, and on his law he meditates day and night. He's like a tree, all the time. And you use those opposites in order to encapsulate that. I think when Jesus comes along and says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, he's not listing out subcategories of what it means to be human that we can take apart. He's giving it kind of an expansive totality of an integrated whole. So I don't there aren't times in which you can love the Lord with your strength without your soul or your mind being involved, and you can't love with your mind without your body being it gets ridiculous when we try to take a reductionistic view. So I would say that from the words of Jesus himself, we have this highly integrated view of what it means to be a human, which gives us the phenomenal capacity to, all right, think about the prayer requests that are offered up at your church last Sunday and will be offered up this Sunday. It's going to be so-and-so has cancer and they're seeing an oncologist. Let's pray for them. And only a Christian can say that with a straight face, because you're looking at, okay, there's a physical component to what's going on here and who I am, and we need trained doctors, and we thank God for them. People go in for surgery, and we ask the Lord to guide the surgeon because we recognize that they're fallible and that things can go wonky, that the surgery would go well. And so we have this total compatibility between the physical and the spiritual in the way that we pray and the way that we envision ourselves. And then also, let's talk just a little side note on mental health here. Is mental health chemical or spiritual? Yes. Can be the answer to both of those. And I think it takes real wisdom as a counselor to be able to parse that out of what's what and what's really going on there. But as a Christian, we shouldn't be surprised that sometimes medication helps. And we also shouldn't be surprised that sometimes our problem isn't medical, but it's spiritual. So there's a way in which this idea that we're fearfully and wonderfully made is more true than we actually know, but allows us to live with an expansive rather than a reductionistic concept of what it means to be human, which I think is more internally consistent, is more coherent, and is far more livable and pleasurable. So even if you wanted to look at it pragmatically, I'm happy.
Yeah. And just a few words here real quickly as we wrap this up on the practical importance of seeing persons as persons. Machines are means to an end. Machines also are basically slaves to us, and we use machines. If we look at human beings like machines, we have a very serious problem. And my argument is that many of us, by default, tend to think in mechanistic terms about persons. And we need to make sure that we recognize persons as persons and that we interact with human beings. We don't ever want to use human beings. And we can point to some of our really lamentable habits in our culture, one of the most conspicuous being pornography, which is just a massive industry, and the consumption on that is so high. But we need a restored vision of a holistic picture of humanity.
Yeah,
and
but
that takes work.
You're about to say something wise and bring this to a conclusion, but is there a sense in which, okay, we make machines, we don't make humans? Now, we're involved in reproduction, so there's a sense in which but the idea of what do we create and what do we control, a machine is nice because it does what we want it to, and humans don't. And so I think there's a tendency to try to exercise some subconscious false narrative of control by imbuing mechanistic terms on something that God created, not something that we manufactured. Just a hunch.
Well, I do, but increasingly, I think we do look at people, even there, we don't make them in the ultimate sense, but we do tend to think of our identity as our own property these days. And so there is a remarkably plastic aspect to human life. So you can go to a gym and remake your body in a sense, and
You can learn another
or you can
language.
tattoo your body. You can alter it. You can do that. You can, all sorts of cosmetic ways to do that. You can change your name. So all of these are, again, kind of instrumental strategies that we have of treating ourselves as, others and ourselves as objects. And that it's so endemic. Some of these we don't even think about. There's, you'd think physical exercise, that's a good thing, right? It can be. It can also be abused and become a form of, control, and it's sort of.
Well, I think Paul said
another way
physical
of
training is of some value. So it's of
Correct.
some value.
Yeah.
It's just not a god, and it
If
doesn't make you one.
if it's a correct, if it's a means to an end and not a god in and of itself. In other words, not an idol to you. So even there, though, because our remarkable technologies allow us to alter ourselves in radical new ways we couldn't in the past. And again, none of these are neutral. They all tend to change the way we think and reshape our understanding of reality. So we just have to be careful that our heads are on straight with all of this, And so, once again, what's the answer? Well, the answer is pray, read your Bible, and go to church. It is that is the answer. Yes, you can occasionally you could read something by David Bentley Hart, but not everybody needs to do that. The real three things that we all need to do are talk to God and read his word, which is the primary, which is still, I don't care where you fall on your denominational spectrum, it's still that's the main place the Lord has chosen to communicate to you. Not saying he doesn't communicate other ways, of course he does. Even Presbyterian Cameron recognizes that. But then go to church.
Yeah, because
this is what we need to do to get in touch with reality.
Because you can download a podcast, but you can't download virtue.
Yeah. So this has been we didn't talk about AI that much here, but I think all of this actually has a bearing.
You're not a machine.
If you think
people.
about this conversation, right? You can see how it's bearing on the topic of AI, and how we often. I think some of our misunderstandings about the threat there are predicated on a misunderstanding of consciousness. But we'll come back to this. Maybe we'll talk more about AI next time as well. But we hope this has been helpful to you. If you're interested, I would suggest David Bentley Hart's book, The Experience of God. Its subtitle is Being, Consciousness, and Bliss. It is a David Bentley Hart book. So therefore, you'll have to put your thinking cap on. To my mind, that's a good thing. So if you want to dig a little deeper, I would recommend that. It's a great place to go. But thank you for listening. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.